The hallway smelled like bleach and gun oil. At 2:17 a.m., the warehouse doors on the outskirts of Mexico City blew inward with a thunderclap, steel screaming, sparks raining down like angry fireflies. Flashbangs burst white and brutal, turning men into silhouettes for half a second before the darkness snapped back. "Federal! Down!" Voices collided in Spanish and English, layered over barking dogs and the sharp, metallic rhythm of rifles being shouldered. Inside, the place looked ordinary until the walls opened. Agents ripped plywood panels away and revealed the real structure, a hidden cage of concrete and rebar built like a tomb. Behind it, stacked in perfect geometry, were bricks wrapped in brown tape, each stamped with a crude black symbol. One pallet became 5. 5 became 20. Evidence techs counted with trembling fingers, calling numbers into recorders. 1,247 kilograms of cocaine, 402 kilograms of meth, 19 AR-style rifles, 12 pistols, 2 of them gold-plated, $4.8 million in U.S. cash, vacuum-sealed into walls, ledgers, burner phones, passports, 3 names for 1 face. The raid was supposed to be about drugs, but the moment they found the binder, it became something else. A thick federal file, white spine, red seal, was pulled from a locked office safe. On the front, stamped in block letters like a death sentence, Queen of the Pacific. Sandra Ávila Beltrán didn't run. She didn't scream. When they brought her out, she walked through the chaos like she owned the noise. Slim, immaculate, hair pinned back despite the storm around her, her eyes were the coldest object in the room. Agents tightened cuffs until the metal bit skin. She didn't flinch. Cameras clicked. Flashlights cut her face into hard angles. Someone read her rights. Someone else whispered, almost reverent, "That's her." Hours later, in Miami, under a ceiling of fluorescent cruelty, prosecutors opened a mirrored version of that file and spoke in a voice built for destruction. International drug trafficking. Conspiracy. The numbers followed like falling stones. Federal exposure, life. Sandra's gaze didn't change. Not when the charges landed. Not when the word extradition entered the air. Not when the seal hit paper. The clerk pressed the stamp down. A dull thud, and the Queen's War began. The courtroom in Miami felt colder than the jail that fed it. On August 14th, 2012, fluorescent light bled across polished wood and stone, turning every face the color of paperwork. Sandra Ávila Beltrán sat at the defense table in a beige detention uniform, wrists chained, posture straight, so still she looked carved into place. The nickname followed her like a shadow the court pretended not to hear. Queen of the Pacific. Her attorney rose with practiced calm, offering conditions like a menu of control, a secured residence, electronic monitoring, surrender of travel documents, private security, a bond so high it sounded like punishment disguised as mercy. He spoke about due process, about the presumption of innocence, about how his client had no incentive to flee. Each sentence was smooth, each word polished to make iron sound soft. Then the prosecutor stood. No theater, no kindness, just a federal voice listing risk the way a coroner lists injuries, international trafficking conspiracy, foreign connections, money beyond counting, a network that could erase borders with a phone call. She has access, the prosecutor said, to resources and protection structures capable of moving her anywhere in the world within hours. The words landed heavy, methodical, like bolts sliding into place. Sandra didn't look at her lawyer. She didn't look at the jury box. She watched the judge the way a gambler watches a final card. The judge leaned forward, eyes tired, voice sharp enough to cut. The courtroom held its breath as he spoke of flight risk, danger, and the sheer weight of the allegations. He acknowledged the proposed conditions, then dismissed them one by one like illusions. Denied. One word, one slammed door. Chains clinked when Sandra shifted, a faint tightening at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile, almost contempt. She had faced men with rifles. She had faced betrayal. But this was a different cage, a legal one, built of statutes and silence, where time itself was the weapon. As marshals lifted her to her feet, whispers rippled through the benches about extradition, about deals, about names she might trade for survival. Outside the courtroom, the war began in corridors and phone lines, pressure campaigns, veiled threats, negotiations disguised as civility. In Miami, the ocean was only miles away. And still, the Queen remained locked in place, watching, calculating, waiting to decide what would break first, the case or the people inside it. Long before Miami, before federal seals and courtroom air conditioning, Sandra learned the first rule in a place where laws were written in cash. She grew up in Sinaloa's heat, where the sun baked dust into everything and men spoke softly because louder voices didn't live long. Her family name traveled faster than her footsteps, whispered at butcher stalls, repeated in cantinas, carried on the wind like a warning. Bloodline didn't always mean royalty, but it meant proximity to smugglers, to soldiers who weren't really soldiers, to businessmen who never showed receipts. As a girl, she watched adults exchange envelopes without glancing down, the way priests accept offerings. She watched fear move through rooms before anyone entered. She learned that respect wasn't asked for, it was collected. And she learned something colder. When people smiled too hard, they were hiding a knife. No one sat her down to explain cartel life. They didn't need to. The lessons came in fragments. A cousin who vanished after bragging. A neighbor whose house burned quietly at night. A woman crying in a kitchen while men outside counted money like rosary beads. Sandra absorbed it all in silence, building her own map of the world. Money speaks, fear obeys, and mercy is the most expensive lie. By her late teens, she understood how a kingdom moved without showing its crown. Roots were not roads. They were relationships. Boats weren't boats. They were alibis. Every border was just a negotiable line. She had an instinct for patterns, for timing, for who controlled what, with a nod. While men around her chased power with violence, she studied the invisible machinery that made violence profitable. Her first step wasn't dramatic, it was paperwork. A quiet job arranging logistics for a legitimate shipment. Seafood export, clean invoices, clean signatures. She didn't touch product, didn't meet dealers, didn't stain her hands. She simply learned the language of containers, schedules, port codes, and customs loopholes. She watched how one altered document could reroute fate, how a phone call could turn inspection into blind trust, how a name placed in the right column could move tons of truth through the world under the mask of business. And when she succeeded, the older men noticed, not because she was loud, because she was precise. In the shadows that raised her, Sandra discovered her real gift. She didn't need a gun to control a room. She only needed the map and the courage to redraw it. Sandra learned early that the loudest men were rarely the most dangerous ones. In a world where power was measured in bullets, she chose a cleaner currency: control. She didn't swagger into rooms. She arrived like a decision already made, hair perfect, expression unreadable, eyes carrying the calm of someone who had seen bodies and never needed to mention it. Men called it beauty. The smart ones recognized steel. At first, she was treated like decoration, daughter of the trade, a name spoken with condescension as if bloodline was all she had. She let them believe it. She listened more than she spoke, collecting details the way others collected watches. Port schedules, warehouse keys, which commander took bribes in cash and which demanded favors. She watched how shipments died, not from police, but from sloppy mouths and impatient egos. Her evolution wasn't sudden, it was surgical. Sandra stopped thinking like a smuggler and started thinking like a system. She understood that the real empire wasn't the drugs, it was the route. The route meant boats, pilots, dock workers, customs officers, accountants, fake companies that paid real taxes. It meant paperwork clean enough to survive a microscope. It meant creating corridors where suspicion never had a reason to wake up. So she built distance. She never carried product, never counted bricks, never met street-level crews unless she wanted them to remember fear. Instead, she became the connector, linking men who hated each other, negotiating truces between violent ambitions, turning chaos into flow. Where others used threats, she used leverage, a withheld phone number, a delayed container, a quiet rumor planted in the right ear. She learned that a shipment could be moved with a signature or killed with a missing stamp. Her phones multiplied, burners that lived only for hours. Her meetings moved from kitchens to salons to private rooms behind legitimate restaurants, where the wine was expensive and the words were coded. She used couriers who didn't know they were couriers and trusted no one with the full picture. Everyone held a piece. Only she held the map. And the most frightening part was how little she needed to show. While men around her performed violence like theater, Sandra made profit look like coincidence. She learned to move tons without touching a gram, by owning the silence between checkpoints, by buying time, by making borders behave. Soon, the cartels didn't just tolerate her, they required her. Because Sandra Ávila Beltrán wasn't a queen by force. She was a queen by design. The first time Sandra heard the name Norte del Valle, it wasn't spoken like a cartel. It was spoken like a doorway. Sinaloa had muscle, roots, and men willing to burn cities for a single shipment. Colombia had production, purity, and an older kind of cruelty, quiet, mathematical, patient. The problem was never the cocaine. The problem was trust. Two empires could drown in their own paranoia long before the ocean ever touched the cargo. Sandra understood that the bridge between them couldn't be another hot-headed lieutenant. It had to be someone who didn't smell like hunger, someone who could speak in numbers instead of threats. So, she became the neutral language. Her introductions were done in rooms without mirrors, where phones died at the door and names were never repeated twice. A Sinaloan delegation arrived with swagger and bodyguards. The Colombians arrived with lawyers and accountants. One side carried guns, the other carried contracts. Sandra arrived with nothing visible, just a small notebook and eyes that measured everyone like inventory. She didn't sell them loyalty. She sold them efficiency. She proposed a structure, rotating maritime routes, staggered land transfers, compartmentalized crews. Every link knew only what it needed to know. Every payment moved through shells, import businesses, seafood exports, real estate flips, washed so clean it could enter a bank smiling. She built layers so thick that even betrayal would reveal only fragments. And she priced trust like a commodity. The Colombians wanted guarantees. Sinaloa wanted control. Sandra offered both, without letting either side touch her. A shipment would leave Colombia with one set of codes, cross the sea under another, and land in Mexico, wearing a third identity entirely. If a container was hit, it wouldn't lead to the network. It would lead to a dead end designed for sacrifice. In that network, Sandra wasn't a boss. She was the hinge. She placed couriers like chess pieces. She scheduled transfers at dawn when inspectors were tired. She bribed not with money first, but with predictability. An officer who is paid regularly becomes an employee, not a risk. She even built fake failures, small losses that kept authorities chasing shadows while the real cargo sailed through untouched. Soon, the corridor was alive. Sinaloa times Norte del Valle wasn't a partnership. It was a pipeline. And Sandra, standing in the middle, became something rarer than a trafficker. She became the reason the two continents moved in rhythm. The first shipment wasn't about profit. It was about proof. Sandra picked the route like a surgeon chooses where to cut. Quiet waters, predictable schedules, ports where corruption was already part of the architecture. The cargo would travel disguised as frozen seafood, packed in industrial crates that smelled like salt and cold innocence. The paperwork was immaculate, clean invoices, real tax stamps, a company that existed on maps and in bank records. Nothing screamed crime. That was the point. In Colombia, the bricks were sealed into a false floor beneath the crates, vacuum-wrapped, double-layered, tagged with invisible ink that only her people could read. The Colombians wanted a show of strength, demanded armed escorts. Sandra refused. Guns attracted attention. Fear attracted mistakes. Her rule was simple. The safest shipment is the one that looks boring. The boat left before sunrise. For 3 days, everything moved as planned, until the fourth night, when a satellite phone rang with a single sentence that made the air turn sharp. Inspection risk. A customs supervisor at the destination port had been replaced unexpectedly. New man. No agreement. no appetite for bribes. At least, not yet. Panic rose through the crews like smoke. Men suggested violence. Others suggested dumping the cargo. Sandra stayed still, listening, then gave orders with the calm of someone tightening a noose. She rerouted the vessel mid-sea. A mechanical issue was reported. The boat requested emergency docking at a secondary port, one where Sandra had already planted a ghost. A logistics manager on her payroll, a warehouse ready, a set of alternate documents waiting in sealed envelopes. The product would rest for 12 hours, then move inland under a different identity, different license plates, different drivers, different uniforms. The original route would be sacrificed like a decoy. At dawn, the first trap snapped shut. Police swarmed the original destination port, inspecting containers that were now empty. They found nothing but fish and ice, and their frustration became noise that would keep them loud and blind for days. Meanwhile, in a warehouse miles away, Sandra's real cargo was already breathing Mexican air. When the final confirmation came, delivery complete, product intact, men celebrated like animals released from a cage. Sandra didn't celebrate. She simply crossed one more line in her notebook and closed it. Because the first shipment had done what she needed. It taught every player in the chain the same lesson. With Sandra, the drugs didn't move by luck. They moved by design. In a windowless room inside a federal building, the war began without a single gunshot. The DEA wire room smelled of burnt coffee and overheated electronics. Screens glowed in rows like silent witnesses, each one tied to a number that didn't belong to a person, only to a threat. Agents sat with headsets pressed tight, pens hovering above notebooks, listening to lives unravel in real time. There was no action here, no hero poses, just patience and the slow violence of attention. They had been chasing the Sinaloa pipeline for months, catching fragments. Dock workers speaking in riddles, accountants arguing over inventory, boat captains saying too little. But everything was scattered, noise without shape, until one call slipped through the net like a blade. A woman's voice, calm, clipped, unhurried. Not the frantic tone of couriers, not the arrogance of gunmen. The words were ordinary, but the rhythm was command. Change the refrigerator schedule, move the seafood to the second freezer, and tell the cousins the wedding is delayed. The rookie analyst laughed once, then stopped, because the senior agent beside him didn't blink. He had heard coded traffic before. This wasn't code. This was architecture, a language designed to survive suspicion. They tagged the voice as unknown female and ran it through comparison tools. No direct match. She wasn't on the street. She wasn't on a watch list. That made it worse. The most dangerous person in a network is the one who doesn't appear in it. Over the next week, they built her profile from sound alone. She never repeated instructions, never used names, never let conversations drift. Calls ended fast. When questioned, others answered like soldiers receiving orders. The pattern tightened. Every time she spoke, movement followed. Containers shifted. Drivers changed. Routes rerouted. The phones around her behaved like planets around a dark star. Then came the first crack. A low-level courier, sweating panic, called for guidance after spotting surveillance near a port gate. The agents leaned in, expecting chaos. Instead, the woman's voice arrived like ice water poured over fire. "Breathe, walk past the blue truck. Don't look back. Your phone is dead in 5 minutes." And he obeyed. Inside the wire room, the senior agent slowly wrote one word on the whiteboard: Queen. Not because she claimed power, because the entire network bowed without seeing her face. Mexico City traffic was its own kind of camouflage. Endless horns, exhaust, and bodies moving like a living wall. Perfect for criminals, perfect for cops, and perfect for a woman who understood both. The surveillance team picked her up just after noon. A silver SUV leaving a quiet neighborhood, windows tinted dark enough to hide faces. 2 unmarked units slid in behind. Another rotated wide to cover the flank. No sirens, no drama, just the slow discipline of a shadow tail. At first, Sandra drove like anyone else. Smooth turns, patient stops, nothing that screamed paranoia. But the agents in the lead car felt it anyway. The invisible pressure in the air when a target is smarter than the file says. She changed lanes 3 times without reason, slowed at a green light, let 2 buses cut in, then accelerated hard, forcing the tail to either follow too close or lose her. "Stay calm," the supervisor whispered. "She's testing." Sandra turned into a shopping district packed with pedestrians and delivery trucks. She parked near a bank, walked out alone. No bodyguards, no entourage. Just a woman in sunglasses and calm confidence. The tail split. One agent followed on foot, another kept eyes from across the street. She didn't enter the bank. She walked past it, continued to a storefront, then stopped at a street vendor and bought a bottle of water, like she had all the time in the world. And that's when the trap revealed itself. She turned slightly, as if stretching her neck, and her gaze landed directly on the agent's reflection in a glass window. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition. The agent's stomach tightened. Sandra smiled faintly, an expression with no warmth, then kept walking. She crossed a street without looking, stepping into traffic like she owned the driver's instincts. The tail hesitated for half a second. That half second almost killed the operation. She entered an underground parking garage. The team followed, heartbeats loud inside their own ears. Concrete swallowed radio signals. Shadows multiplied. Brake lights flashed like warning flares. The SUV disappeared behind a pillar, then reappeared, heading the wrong direction. Fast. "Move!" someone shouted. The unmarked unit tried to cut her off. Sandra swung sharply, inches from impact, then shot up the exit ramp with perfect control. Tires squealed. A pedestrian screamed. The agents burst back into daylight just in time to see her SUV vanish into the city's bloodstream. On the radio, silence. Not the silence of failure, the silence of realization. The Queen didn't just run routes, she ran people. And she could feel a tail the way prey feels a predator's breath. The message arrived before sunrise, delivered with the kind of cruelty that didn't need a signature. A municipal worker found it behind a seafood depot near the port, wedged between trash bins as if it were just another piece of rot. When he pulled the tarp away, the stench hit first, thick and sweet like spoiled meat. Then the shape became clear in the dim light. A man folded wrong, hands bound, mouth stuffed with cloth. His throat had been cut with precision, not rage. This wasn't a killing, it was punctuation. Pinned to his chest was a plastic card sealed in tape. No handwriting, no threats. Just a printed phrase, clean and cold. Stop listening. By 8 a.m., the photo sat on a federal desk. Agents stared at it in silence, the way doctors stare at an X-ray that confirms the worst. The dead man was a minor courier, barely a name, barely a file. But inside his pocket, they found a burner phone, crushed like someone had tried to erase evidence with their heel. The SIM was missing. The warning wasn't just blood. It was intelligence. Someone knew about the wire. The DEA wire room turned into a pressure chamber. Headsets stayed on. Voices sharpened. Every call that once sounded ordinary now carried weight. Every pause, every breath, every coded reference. Analysts replayed recordings and realized patterns they'd missed. Sudden changes in language, roots shifting mid-sentence, a silence after key phrases like someone was listening for echoes. Then came the second strike. A confidential informant, an accountant tied to port paperwork, failed to show up for a scheduled meet. His phone rang until it died. His apartment was found immaculate, almost staged, clothes still folded, toothbrush still wet. No struggle, no blood, just absence. A human erased so smoothly, it felt like magic. That night, a new call surfaced on the wire. A man spoke in low Spanish, voice thick with fear. "They took him," he whispered. "They said he talked." A woman's voice answered, not loud, not angry. Then he should have learned to stay quiet. The room went still. No one breathed. It wasn't the words that chilled them. It was the tone. Calm, certain, like a judge passing sentence. The supervisor stepped back from the monitors and stared at the wall of numbers. The case wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about control, about fear used as a firewall, violence as encryption. Sandra's network wasn't merely moving product. It was hunting anyone who tried to see it. And in Miami, miles away, the legal world still believed it was dealing with a defendant. Here, in the shadows, they understood the truth. They were dealing with a queen who sent messages in blood. The tuna boats were the perfect lie. Rusted hulls, tired crews, and paperwork that looked as harmless as a grocery list. They left the coast at dusk, like they always had, nets stacked, diesel smoke trailing behind, radios crackling with jokes and weather reports. But beneath the deck, under layers of ice and fish stink, the real cargo slept in plastic-wrapped bricks sealed into watertight coffins. Sandra's system wasn't built on speed. It was built on routine. A normal smuggling crew needs silence, luck, and brute intimidation. Sandra replaced luck with engineering. Her boats ran in rotating cycles, 2 clean voyages for every dirty one, so inspectors grew bored. GPS trackers were swapped mid-route. Fuel logs were falsified with believable errors. Custom stamps were copied, then validated by an official who thought he was bribed for fish exports. Everything looked slightly imperfect, because perfection draws suspicion. At midnight, the transfer began. Far from shore, the tuna boat met a second vessel with no name, no lights, and no recorded existence. They drifted together in black water as if the ocean itself had agreed to forget. Men moved fast, sweating under hooded raincoats, lifting sealed drums from hidden compartments. Inside each drum, bricks wrapped in brown tape, layered under frozen fish to defeat dogs and scanners. A chain of hands passed them across like a ritual. No shouting, no arguments, only discipline sharpened by fear. If police hit the tuna boat, they would find fish. If they hit the ghost vessel, they would find nothing but fuel and empty lockers. The product never stayed with the same crew long enough to become evidence. That was Sandra's signature, a moving target made of moving people. On land, the port was another machine. Containers rolled through like steel coffins on wheels. Her men wore legitimate uniforms, carried legitimate clipboards, used legitimate barcodes, while the real shipments slid into prearranged inspection zones where no inspector ever arrived. A forklift operator, paid monthly like a salaryman, moved the wrong container to the right truck. One number changed in the manifest, one seal replaced in a dark corner, and the drugs traveled into Mexico, wearing the mask of seafood, cement, or auto parts. By morning, the tuna boats returned with empty nets and clean smiles. And Sandra's empire grew, quietly, efficiently, built not on chaos, but on the cold perfection of midnight cargo. Money never smelled like cocaine in Sandra's world. It smelled like perfume, paperwork, and polished marble. The cash arrived dirty, wrinkled bills bundled in tape, stained by sweat and fear, carried in duffel bags that weighed more than guilt. But Sandra never let it stay dirty for long. She treated money the way she treated cargo. Split it, mask it, move it through layers until no one could trace its heartbeat. First came the mirrors, front businesses that looked ordinary enough to survive casual scrutiny. Seafood exporters, boutique clothing stores, a chain of beauty salons where every receipt was a reason to launder. Jewelry shops that sold diamonds paid for in cash. Car dealerships that moved inventory even when the lot stayed full. She understood the trick. A dirty dollar doesn't become clean by hiding. It becomes clean by pretending to be normal. Her accountants were ghosts. They worked behind locked doors, surrounded by spreadsheets that read like fiction. They didn't ask where money came from. They only asked how fast it needed to disappear. Transactions were broken into smaller streams. $9,800 deposits to dodge bank reports, daily transfers through shell accounts, loan repayments to companies that didn't really exist. The money traveled through Panama, through offshore trusts, through real estate flips that turned drug profit into investment returns. She even washed money with charity. Donations to community events, sponsorships for local boxing gyms, school supplies delivered with cameras nearby. The public saw generosity. Investigators saw camouflage, because nothing protects a criminal like a reputation that feels human. In the wire room, agents called it the money mirror, because every trail reflected back a clean face. They'd trace a payment to a seafood company, only to find real taxes filed. They'd follow a property purchase, only to meet lawyers with crisp suits and legal answers. Every door opened into another door. Every account led to another account. The laundering wasn't sloppy. It was elegant, designed to make suspicion look paranoid. Sandra knew violence built fear, but money built permanence. She didn't want to be rich. She wanted to be untouchable. And as long as her empire looked like legitimate success, restaurants, condos, investments, no judge could easily separate myth from proof. The drugs were hidden in boats and containers, but the real power, it was hidden in the numbers. Sandra never announced rules. She made people learn them the hard way. Her circle was small, too small for betrayal to hide. The men around her were violent by nature, raised on ego and blood. She didn't try to change them. She weaponized them. Every meeting was quiet, every instruction precise, every consequence absolute. In her world, loyalty wasn't a promise. It was a contract enforced by fear. The first rule was distance. No one touched the full operation. A dock worker knew containers. A driver knew roads. An accountant knew numbers. None of them knew the whole machine. Even her own lieutenants held only pieces, like puzzle fragments that couldn't form a picture without her hands. The second rule was silence. Mouths killed faster than bullets. She punished talking the way surgeons cut infection. Clean, immediate, without emotion. A careless cousin once bragged in a bar about ocean deliveries. 2 days later, his tongue was found in a plastic bag on his doorstep. Not because Sandra enjoyed cruelty, but because the message had to be unforgettable. The third rule was mercy costs more than murder. She didn't waste blood unless blood was profitable. She preferred leverage, pressure, and humiliation, methods that broke people without creating martyrs. When a courier stole from a shipment, Sandra didn't kill him. She made him return the money in public, then forced him to work unpaid for 6 months under constant surveillance. The man survived, but he became a warning that walked. Her rule wasn't loud. It was systematic. She used routine punishments like tools, delayed payments, revoked protection, denied routes, exposed secrets to rival crews. In cartel life, being alive without protection was worse than being dead. Sandra understood this deeply. She didn't need to threaten men with death. She threatened them with being left alone. Even her emotions followed rules. She didn't mourn openly. She didn't celebrate loudly. She didn't love in ways that created weakness. Grief stayed behind closed doors. Pleasure stayed brief. Every attachment became a potential hostage, so she kept her heart locked behind the same steel that guarded her shipments. To outsiders, she looked composed, almost elegant. To insiders, she was colder than the men with guns. And that was why she rose. Sandra Ávila Beltrán didn't survive by being the strongest. She survived by being the most disciplined, turning fear into order, order into empire, and empire into a throne no one dared challenge. Mexico City traffic was thick with late afternoon heat, when the black BMW slipped into the boulevard like a blade. Clean, expensive, untouchable. Tinted windows, quiet engine. A car that didn't belong to ordinary people. It had been watched for days. 2 blocks ahead, an unmarked unit rolled into position. Another waited at the next intersection. On rooftops, silhouettes lay flat behind concrete lips, rifles resting, optics steady, breathing controlled. The operation was built like a trap. No sirens, no flashing lights, only geometry and timing. When the BMW crossed the invisible line, the street became a cage. A traffic officer stepped out first. Routine uniform, routine posture, one hand raised as if it was just another stop. The BMW slowed. The driver's fingers tightened around the wheel. For half a second, everything looked normal. Then the city exploded. Now! A voice cracked through radios. Unmarked doors flew open. Tactical agents surged from both sides, weapons up, bodies moving fast and hard. Tires screamed as vehicles boxed the BMW in. Front bumper, inches from its grill, rear bumper kissing its tail. The officer yanked the door handle, locked. A baton shattered glass with one brutal strike. Inside, Sandra Ávila Beltrán didn't scream. She sat in the back seat, perfectly still, as if the violence outside was happening in another world. Her eyes were sharp, cold, almost bored. A second agent ripped the rear door open. "Hands!" he shouted. She lifted them slowly, palms open, wrists bare, calm like a queen offering her hands for cuffs. The driver tried to reach under his seat. A rifle muzzle hit his cheekbone with a crack that sounded like wood splitting. Blood splattered the leather. He collapsed, choking. Sandra didn't flinch, not even when the barrel swung toward her face. They pulled her out. Cuffs clicked shut, metal on skin, final as a verdict. Agents pressed her against the hood. Cameras appeared from nowhere, hungry lenses capturing the moment the myth became a defendant. One of the commanders stepped forward, holding a printed photograph. Her face, her name, her known aliases. Under it, bold letters that chilled even seasoned cops. La Reina del Pacífico. Sandra stared at the paper, then at the commander. Her expression didn't break. No tears, no pleading. Only that same controlled emptiness, as if she'd expected this day, rehearsed it, accepted it long ago. Behind them, evidence teams swarmed the BMW. Hidden compartments were opened. Burner phones, coded notebooks, SIM cards, cash stacks bound in tape. Not the cargo itself. Never the cargo. Sandra didn't carry bricks. She carried control. And in the middle of a crowded boulevard, with rifles aimed and cameras flashing, Mexico City watched the Queen of the Pacific step into handcuffs without losing her crown. Prison didn't break Sandra. It refined her. The first night behind bars, the air smelled of sweat, disinfectant, and old fear. Metal doors slammed like gunshots, and women's voices echoed through concrete corridors. Sandra Ávila Beltrán walked in with chains on her wrists, head held level, eyes scanning the place the way she once scanned ports and shipping manifests, looking for patterns, weaknesses, exits. They tried to strip her down to a number, uniform, cell, routine. But routine was her weapon. Within days, she learned the rhythm of guards, who drank too much coffee, who flirted for attention, who hated paperwork enough to accept favors. She learned which inmates controlled phone access, which ones sold protection, which ones traded secrets like cigarettes. Sandra didn't fight for dominance with fists. She offered structure, quiet deals, small gifts, promises whispered with certainty. Soon, the cell became a command post. A lawyer visit turned into a meeting. A family call turned into coded instructions. Notes moved through laundry bags. Legal documents were marked with invisible signals. While prosecutors believed she was contained, Sandra's network adapted outside. Routes shifting, lieutenants stepping forward, money continuing to flow like blood, finding new veins. Other inmates watched her with awe and hatred. Some tried to test her. One woman spat near her shoes in the yard, murmuring insults about the Queen. Sandra didn't react. That night, the same woman lost her privileges. Commissary stolen, phone time erased, alliances collapsing overnight. No punches, no screams, just consequences. That was Sandra's prison rule. Violence was messy. Control was clean. Even in confinement, she never begged, never cried in public. When guards searched her cell, she stood calmly and watched, as if memorizing their hands. When doors locked, she didn't look trapped. She looked patient. Because Sandra wasn't waiting to be freed. She was waiting to negotiate. Extradition wasn't a legal procedure in Sandra's world. It was a battlefield with paperwork instead of bullets. From her cell, she watched the first move, the U.S. request sliding across Mexican courts like a blade wrapped in velvet. Federal prosecutors in Miami wanted her under their ceiling. Conspiracy, international trafficking, a narrative big enough to justify life. Mexico hesitated, caught between sovereignty and pressure, between politics and fear of what she could reveal. Sandra's lawyers turned the case into chess. They filed injunctions, appealed technicalities, demanded translations, questioned jurisdiction. Every delay was a victory. Every postponed hearing bought time for her network to adjust outside. Court calendars became smuggling routes. Dates shifted like shipments. She understood something most criminals never did. Time is power. The government pushed back with its own pieces. Judges were reassigned. Witnesses were secured. Evidence packages grew heavier. Rumors leaked to the press. Portraits of her as a myth, a queen, a monster, to poison public sympathy. In response, her defense painted her as a scapegoat, a woman punished for a legend created by men. Between those two narratives, Sandra stayed silent. But pressure arrived anyway, quiet and ruthless. A lawyer received an anonymous call promising death if he forgot loyalty. A prosecutor's relative was followed for 3 nights. A prison guard found a bullet wrapped in paper on his windshield. No messages signed, no fingerprints, only reminders that the Queen still had reach. Negotiations began in corridors no cameras filmed, offers disguised as legal strategy, reduce exposure, trade information, protect certain names. Sandra listened, calculating costs like inventory. She wouldn't confess to crimes she didn't need to. She wouldn't sacrifice assets that could still move. She would, however, trade myth for survival if it preserved the core. Then, the U.S. made its strongest move, an extradition lane backed by diplomacy and force. Mexico's court doors narrowed, the board tightened. Sandra's delays started to fail. In that moment, she finally understood The cage wasn't metal. It was the world deciding she was no longer useful alive on Mexican soil. On August 10th, 2012, the transfer happened without fanfare, because fanfare creates targets. Before dawn, Sandra Ávila Beltrán was pulled from her cell and marched through corridors that smelled of damp concrete and resignation. Shackles tightened around her ankles, cuffs locked at her wrists, a chain linking her movement to the slow rhythm of custody. She didn't ask questions. She didn't plead. She walked as if the hallway belonged to her, as if every guard was merely part of the scenery. Outside, an armored convoy waited in silence. Black vehicles, tinted glass, engines idling like restrained animals. Federal officers moved with strict choreography, no wasted steps, no words louder than necessary. They treated her not like a prisoner, but like a volatile shipment, high value, high risk, dangerous to mishandle. The legend wasn't just her reputation, it was what she could trigger if she escaped. At the airfield, the wind cut sharp. Cameras were kept away. Paperwork traveled faster than faces. Sandra was guided up the stairs of a white aircraft with no markings bold enough to be remembered. Inside, the cabin was cold, sealed, mechanical. She sat alone in the rear, surrounded by men who stared forward as if looking at her might tempt fate. As the plane lifted, Mexico fell away beneath a layer of haze. Streets, ports, mountains, all shrinking into a distant map. For years, she had controlled routes like these, moving cargo across invisible lines. Now, she was the cargo, carried across borders under guard. In the air, she closed her eyes for a moment, not in fear, but in calculation. She knew what awaited her in the United States: federal prosecutors, sealed indictments, rules that didn't bend for cartel money, a courtroom that didn't care about legend, only evidence, and Miami, bright, humid, merciless, where her name would be spoken in English like a curse. When the aircraft landed in Florida, the handover was swift. U.S. Marshals took custody as if receiving a weapon. New chains, new commands, new faces with colder eyes. Sandra stepped onto American soil, and the air felt different, less forgiving. A legend had crossed the border. And in Miami, the cage was already built. The Miami Detention Center didn't look like a palace, but it had the same purpose: to crush resistance through routine. Sandra was processed like contraband, fingerprinted, photographed, searched until privacy became a memory. The fluorescent lights never softened. The walls sweated cold. Even time felt artificial, measured by door buzzers and meal trays sliding through slots. She had entered a different empire now, one built on policy and paperwork, where intimidation wore a badge. But the battlefield inside wasn't physical, it was psychological. Within hours, the pressure began. A federal agent offered her water and a smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Cooperate," he said gently, as if suggesting therapy. "Help us understand the network. Help yourself." The words were polite, but the threat beneath them was blunt. In U.S. court, myths didn't save you. Numbers did. Names did. Sandra listened without reacting. Then came the lawyers, sharp suits, controlled voices, folders thick enough to feel like bricks. They explained exposure, conspiracy charges that stacked like weight, guidelines that climbed toward life. They spoke of possible deals, of reduced counts, of what could be managed if she gave them something real. Between each sentence, Sandra saw the truth. Everyone in that room was negotiating, even if they pretended it was justice. The jailhouse became a web. Informants floated near her like insects, women offering friendship too quickly, asking too many questions. Guards lingered at her cell longer than necessary. Word spread that the Queen of the Pacific had arrived, and with it came opportunity and danger. Some inmates wanted protection, others wanted status. A few wanted revenge by proxy. Sandra didn't respond to any of it. Silence was her armor. But the real war happened outside the bars. Phone lines burned with coded messages. Attorneys carried whispers in and out, warnings about faction shifting, about lieutenants growing ambitious, about the network reshaping itself without her hand on the map. She understood the risk. A queen removed from the board invites betrayal. Her empire could survive law enforcement. It might not survive its own hunger. Every night, she lay on a thin mattress, staring at a ceiling that never went dark, and weighed choices like weapons. Fight the case and risk dying in prison. Trade information and risk dying outside it. Trust no one and become irrelevant. Trust the wrong one and become dead. In Miami, the cage wasn't just steel. It was decision. And Sandra Ávila Beltrán realized that in this new battlefield, the most dangerous trigger was not a gun. It was a signature. The morning of August 14th, 2012, Miami felt clean on the surface. Sunlight on glass towers, palm trees swaying like nothing evil had ever happened. Inside the federal courthouse, the air was different. Recycled, cold, sharp with tension. Sandra Ávila Beltrán was brought in chained at the waist and ankles. Beige uniform, no jewelry, no perfume. Yet she still carried the same presence. Quiet authority, eyes steady, face unreadable. The room watched her like she was evidence that could breathe. Her defense argued bail like a final rescue. They offered a secured residence, electronic monitoring, strict reporting, surrender of travel documents, and a bond large enough to make the word freedom sound expensive. They insisted she would face the charges, that the government's portrait of her was inflated by myth. Her lawyer spoke of fairness, of procedure, of a woman treated as a legend instead of a defendant. The prosecutor answered with facts sharpened into weapons, foreign ties, resources, a network capable of extracting her like cargo. The charges were heavy enough to bend any human spine. International drug trafficking, conspiracy, federal exposure that pointed toward life. This defendant, the prosecutor said, has every incentive to flee. The words weren't loud, but they hit the room like a locked bolt. Sandra listened without blinking. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the flags. She watched the judge, reading him like a route map. The judge leaned forward, expression hard, voice measured. He spoke about risk, about the nature of the allegations, about the impossibility of guaranteeing control over someone built on control. One by one, he dismantled the defense proposals. Monitoring could be defeated. Money could buy escapes. A bond could not buy certainty. Then he ended it. Bail is denied. A single sentence, short, final, brutal. Chains clinked as marshals moved in. Sandra rose calmly, as if the decision confirmed something she already knew. Her eyes didn't soften. If anything, they turned colder, because now the game was official. As she was led away, the legal war ignited behind her. Extradition shadows, pressure lines, threats whispered through attorneys, negotiations wrapped in polite language. In Miami, the Queen wasn't released. She was sealed. The courier they called Ghost never used the same car twice. He left the warehouse outside Veracruz at 4:36 a.m., driving a white pickup with construction decals and mud on the tires. Perfect camouflage for dawn traffic. In the bed sat two sealed toolboxes that weren't tools, strapped down like ordinary cargo. Inside were vacuum-wrapped bricks worth more than the lives transporting them. DEA intelligence had flagged the move. A joint team rolled out in unmarked units, blending into the highway like predators wearing civilian skin. The plan was simple: tail him, identify the safe house, hit the whole chain at once. No early arrests, no spooking the network. But Ghost smelled the trap. At kilometer marker 112, he slowed for no reason. Turned signal left, then right, then off. The pickup drifted toward a service lane, then snapped back into traffic, forcing the nearest unmarked unit to brake hard. The gap widened. "He's checking mirrors," the supervisor muttered. "Stay loose." Ghost took the next exit suddenly, no hesitation, cutting across lanes with the brutality of someone who didn't believe in accidents. Tires screamed, horns erupted, the tail broke formation to survive. That was the point. The pickup slammed onto a two-lane road framed by sugarcane fields. Here the world became narrow, one direction forward, one chance to stop him. The lead agent pushed speed, 180, 200. The engine whined like it was begging to quit. Wind battered the car, turning every bump into a punch. Ghost didn't just run. He hunted. A black sedan appeared ahead, blocking the lane like a casual mistake. The agent swerved. The sedan swerved too, trying to force contact. A metal scrape, sparks, a violent jolt. The unmarked car fish-tailed, almost flipping into the ditch. The sedan peeled away, laughing in exhaust. "Ambush! 2 vehicles!" someone shouted. Then came the gunfire. Short, controlled bursts from a passing motorcycle. Bullets cracked glass. One agent's cheek exploded with blood. The car kept moving, half blind, adrenaline steering what eyesight couldn't. Ghost's pickup hit a bridge and suddenly braked. The tail nearly collided. Ghost spun out, clipped the guardrail, then surged forward again, using chaos as a shield. An agent drew a pistol through a shattered window, aiming for tires. A shot rang. Rubber blew. The pickup wobbled, but Ghost didn't stop. He drove on rims, sparks spraying like fireworks, refusing to surrender. The highway behind him became a ribbon of blood and metal. And in that smoke-filled dawn, the investigators realized something terrifying. Even with Sandra in a cage, her roads still fought back. He had lived inside their world for 9 months, and the hardest part wasn't fear. It was pretending he wasn't afraid. The undercover asset, coded as Rook, stood in a motel parking lot outside Tampico, sweat crawling down his spine beneath a cheap leather jacket. The deal was supposed to be routine: deliver paperwork, collect a phone, confirm the next handoff. No drugs, no weapons, just logistics. That was how Sandra's people tested loyalty, by making betrayal invisible. Two men arrived in a gray SUV. No smiles, no greetings. One stared at Rook's shoes too long, the way predators stare at wounds. The other held a small plastic bag with a burner phone and tossed it like trash. "Open it," he said. Rook's hands didn't shake. He ripped the packaging calmly, as if boredom lived in his veins. Inside was the phone and a folded paper, 4 numbers written in pen, a time, a location, a silent order. Then the trap snapped shut. A third man stepped from behind the SUV, raising a pistol without hurry. "Who do you work for?" he asked softly. Not a question, a ritual. Rook's heartbeat tried to climb into his throat. He forced it down. "I work for money," he answered. "Same as you." The pistol pressed into his ribs, hard enough to bruise. They marched him into a motel hallway that smelled of bleach and cheap sex. No cameras, no witnesses. A door opened. Inside, the room was empty, except for a chair and a plastic sheet on the floor. Interrogation didn't need violence at first. It needed psychology. They asked about names, about routes, about why he hesitated on the highway last week, about a phone number he'd called too often. Rook lied cleanly, using half-truths like armor. But the men weren't stupid. They watched his eyes. They listened to his breathing. They were searching for a crack. When they didn't find it, they created one. A punch landed in his gut, silent, efficient, knocking air from his lungs. Another hit his jaw, flashing stars across his vision. The pistol moved into his mouth, tasting teeth. "Last chance," the man whispered. Rook swallowed blood and smiled faintly. "If I was a cop," he rasped, "you'd already be dead." For a moment, the room froze. Then the door exploded inward. Federal agents stormed the hallway, too early, too loud, too risky. A rescue forced by panic. Gunfire cracked. One cartel man dropped. The other grabbed Rook as a shield, arm locked around his throat, pistol to his temple. The air became a tight wire. Rook twisted, fought, slammed his elbow back. The pistol fired, ear-splitting, missing his skull by inches. He tore free as agents tackled the gunman into the plastic sheet, bodies rolling, fists hammering, weapon wrestling in sweat and rage. When it ended, Rook stood shaking, not from fear, but from the truth. His cover was dead, and somewhere, someone was already telling Sandra that the mole had burned. The counterstrike didn't come with bullets at first. It came with paper. Within 48 hours of Rook's extraction, Miami prosecutors received a motion package thick as a brick. New challenges, new accusations, new delays. Defense attorneys began flooding the court with technical warfare, jurisdiction disputes, evidence suppression requests, claims of misconduct. Every filing forced hearings. Every hearing burned time. And time, Sandra knew, was oxygen. Then the pressure turned personal. An assistant U.S. attorney found a photo slipped under his office door. His daughter walking to school, time-stamped, zoomed close enough to count her hairpins. No note, no threat, just proof. A marshal's wife received a bouquet at her workplace. Roses wrapped around a single bullet. A port informant in Mexico stopped answering calls. When agents went to his apartment, they found the place empty. Refrigerator still humming, toothbrush still wet. Sandra's reach moved like smoke through the system. In jail, she didn't need to speak loudly. She simply needed to speak to the right people. One attorney visit lasted 7 minutes. After it, 3 couriers changed routes, and 2 witnesses suddenly withdrew. A second visit lasted 5 minutes. That night, a cooperating defendant in a related case asked for protective custody, shaking, claiming he'd been told his mother's address. The investigation team watched the case shift from pursuit to endurance. Calls turned colder, wiretaps filled with silence, burners died faster, meetings moved to places with no cameras. Sandra's network started behaving like an animal that sensed hunters, tightening, biting, disappearing into cover. The violence wasn't random now, it was selective. A warning designed to make law enforcement doubt whether victory was worth the cost. At a briefing, the supervisor slammed his palm on the table. "She's fighting us from a cell," he said. "That's what we're up against." And in the detention center, Sandra sat behind glass during attorney call time, face calm, eyes steady, like the court's chains were temporary, like the real battlefield still belonged to her. Because she understood something brutal. You don't have to escape prison to strike back. You only have to make everyone else feel imprisoned too. The port at night looked like a city of steel, containers stacked like cliffs, cranes looming like skeletal gods, sodium lights bleeding yellow over wet asphalt. Everything echoed, chains, engines, distant waves. Perfect noise for hiding crime. Perfect noise for catching it. The sting began at 22:40. A surveillance van sat tucked behind a row of empty trailers, windows blacked out, radios low. On the screen, a container code flashed in green, MXV-7714. It had arrived legally, declared as auto parts. But wiretaps had whispered its real name for weeks. The freezer. A shipment too valuable to risk twice. Agents were already inside the port, wearing reflective vests and hard hats, moving like ordinary workers. One team stood near the gatehouse, eyes on incoming trucks. Another waited near the inspection lane, fingers hovering near concealed pistols. Customs officers on payroll had been cut out. Tonight, the port belonged to law enforcement. At 23:12, the target arrived. A blue semi rolled in, slow and confident, driver chewing gum like he owned the asphalt. Behind it, a second truck followed at distance. Escort, insurance, threat. The gate scanner beeped. Papers were handed over. The driver didn't look nervous. That was the signature. Sandra's people didn't act guilty. They acted routine. "Hold," the supervisor murmured. The semi crawled forward, heading toward a dark corner of the yard where cranes rarely worked. A forklift operator waved it in. The move was clean, too clean. The undercover dock agent zoomed his camera, capturing the operator's wrist tattoo, the way his left hand tapped twice on the doorframe. Signal confirmed. Now, Floodlights snapped on like interrogation lamps. Sirens erupted. Unmarked vehicles surged from shadows, boxing the trucks in. Agents ran fast, rifles up, shouting commands in Spanish. The escort truck tried to reverse, tires squealing, but a cruiser slammed its rear quarter panel, metal folding with a scream. The semi-driver reached under his seat. A K-9 handler tackled him before the gun cleared fabric. Bodies hit the ground hard. A pistol clattered across asphalt. The dog barked like it wanted blood. Bolt cutters ripped the container seal open. For a second, there was only the smell, cold air mixed with oil and plastic. Then agents saw it. Crates stacked high, labeled with fake part numbers. Behind them, a false wall. A pry bar tore it away, revealing tight rows of brown-wrapped bricks packed into insulated panels like organs in a body. Evidence techs counted aloud, voices shaking. Hundreds, then thousands. Tonight, the port wasn't moving cargo. It was exposing an empire. They thought the port was the heart. It was only the artery. 2 nights after the sting, the informant finally cracked. Hands shaking, face gray, voice whispering coordinates like he was reciting his own execution. "It's not stored there," he said. "It's stored under it." The vault sat beneath an abandoned cold storage facility 20 miles inland, hidden behind legitimate leases and fake renovation permits. From the outside, it looked dead. Cracked concrete, rusted signage, weeds swallowing the loading docks. But agents saw the details that didn't belong. Fresh tire marks, new padlocks, cameras disguised as broken lights. At 1:08, the strike team moved. Night vision turned darkness into green ghosts. A breaching ram kissed the steel side door, then slammed once, twice, until the lock shattered. Inside, silence waited, thick as dust. They moved down a corridor lined with empty freezer rooms, boots whispering over tile. At the far end, a wall looked ordinary, until thermal imaging showed heat behind it. A false wall. Explosives were denied. Too risky. Instead, the team drilled, cut, pried. The panel gave way with a groan, revealing a staircase descending into black. The smell hit first. Damp earth, diesel, and something chemical, like money stored too long. Downstairs was a concrete tunnel, reinforced with rebar. A second door waited at the end, heavy, modern, protected by a keypad and fingerprint scanner. It wasn't cartel-style improvisation. It was engineered, expensive, professional, built to survive raids. Breach! The charge popped with a sharp crack. The door blew inward, and the underground swallowed sound for half a second, then erupted. Armed guards emerged from shadows, firing. Muzzle flashes lit the tunnel like lightning. Agents returned fire, weapons deafening in the tight space. A guard rushed with a machete, madness in his eyes, until an agent slammed him into the wall and wrestled the blade away. Bodies collided, fists landed, sweat mixed with dust. A pistol skittered across the floor. Someone screamed, someone prayed. Then the gunfire stopped. Inside the vault, the scale was obscene. Stacks of bricks sealed in plastic, packed in metal drums, crates of cash wrapped in vacuum bags, assault rifles in foam-lined cases, a ledger wall, coded notebooks, USB drives, phone lists. Evidence techs stood frozen as if the room had rewritten gravity. One agent lifted a brick, weighing it in both hands. "This," he whispered, "is the Empire." And above ground, the night kept breathing, unaware that beneath its feet, Sandra's hidden kingdom had just been torn open. The vault raid should have ended the night. Instead, it opened a wound. At 3:21, while evidence techs photographed bricks and counted cash, a junior agent found a thin black folder wrapped in plastic and taped to the underside of a steel shelf. No labels, no fingerprints, only a faint smell of cologne, too refined for a storage hole. Inside were names. Not the usual nicknames scrawled in cartel slang, but real identities. Drivers with passport numbers, customs officials with bank accounts, shell company directors with home addresses. And in the center, a single code phrase repeated like a heartbeat: Pacific Line, off book. The betrayal file. Back at the command post, analysts spread the pages like surgeons exposing organs. One name leaped off the paper, a lieutenant everyone believed untouchable, Sandra's trusted connector for a secondary route. If the folder was real, it meant one thing. Someone inside the network had prepared an insurance policy. A flip. They found him by sunrise at a roadside motel, sitting alone with a suitcase he hadn't packed fully. He looked too calm at first, then too terrified when agents entered. His hands shook when he raised them. His eyes kept darting to the window as if expecting bullets to arrive faster than warrants. He didn't last 10 minutes. "She's locked up," he whispered, "but she still controls everything. The vault was only one room. There are others." He offered maps, schedules, phone numbers, too many details, too fast, like a man dumping poison out of his body. He spoke of an off-book channel designed to bypass routes under pressure, smaller loads, faster turnarounds, violence-ready crews, a hidden corridor that didn't exist on ledgers. But the flip came with a price. Protection, new identity, immediate extraction of his family. He knew Sandra's rule. Betrayal wasn't punished, it was erased. No one disappeared quietly unless the Queen wanted them gone. Agents promised him safety with official voices, but inside the room, everyone understood the risk. The moment he spoke, his countdown started. Hours later, the first warning arrived. A text to his old phone. A photo of his mother's front door, time-stamped, with one word beneath it. Listening. The lieutenant's face drained of color. He began shaking uncontrollably, eyes wide, breath shallow. "She knows," he said. "She always knows." In that instant, the investigation crossed a line. This wasn't simply building a case, it was racing death. The betrayal file could collapse the entire network, but only if the man who held the last pieces survived long enough to hand them over. And somewhere, far away, Sandra's empire adjusted, like a beast turning toward the scent of blood. The plea day didn't feel like justice. It felt like a calculated surrender. On April 23, 2013, Sandra Ávila Beltrán entered the Miami courtroom in chains, escorted by U.S. Marshals who treated her like a storm that could still break loose. The room was packed. Reporters, federal agents, lawyers hungry for history. Yet the silence was heavier than the crowd. Everyone understood what was happening. The Queen of the Pacific was about to trade myth for survival. Her attorney spoke first, voice controlled, eyes never leaving the judge. He framed it as responsibility, as closure, as a decision made under the weight of evidence. But the prosecutor's file on the table told the real story. Wiretap transcripts, money traces, logistics maps, photographs of seizures, and enough cooperating witnesses to build a prison wall around her for life. Sandra listened, chin slightly raised, expression smooth as glass. When the judge asked her to state her plea, the courtroom held its breath. Cameras stopped clicking, pens paused. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter. "Guilty," she said. One word, flat, clean, without emotion. Not guilty to the grand legend the world wanted, but guilty to a charge crafted like a narrow escape route, accessory after the fact, a legal compromise that acknowledged her role without forcing the court to prove every bloody threat of the empire. It was strategy disguised as defeat, a bridge between the prosecution's hunger and the defense's survival plan. The prosecutor read the facts into the record, that she helped the trafficking machine, protected it, concealed it, kept it moving. Each sentence landed like a nail. Sandra didn't protest. She didn't plead for mercy. She accepted the narrative as if it was simply another document to be signed. The judge watched her closely, searching for cracks, fear, regret, arrogance. But Sandra's face stayed cold. If she felt anything, she buried it deeper than any vault. Outside the courthouse, people would call it the fall of a queen. Inside, it was something else entirely, a queen choosing the shape of her cage. Because in federal court, even monsters learn to negotiate with time. The courtroom on sentence day felt like a theater where nobody applauded. Sandra stood before the judge in a plain uniform, wrists cuffed, ankles chained, posture still straight, defiant without needing to perform defiance. Her hair was pulled back with prison precision. Her face carried no makeup, no softness, no signal of weakness, only a calm that made the room uncomfortable. The prosecutor spoke as if reading an autopsy. He summarized the empire in numbers and consequences, roots that poisoned cities, money that corrupted institutions, violence that left families counting missing names. Even without the full conspiracy trial, he painted her as a central gravity point, someone who made trafficking efficient, protected it, sanitized it. Her defense fought for the smallest mercy left. They spoke of time already served, of cooperation, of punishment enough. They insisted she was not the monster the nickname suggested. That legend had inflated her role into myth. The lawyer's voice rose and fell like a man trying to hold back a tide with his hands. Then the judge began to speak. His tone was measured, but every word cut. He acknowledged the plea. He acknowledged the guidelines. He acknowledged the public hunger for spectacle. And then he delivered the number that would define her American chapter. 70 months. The sentence landed like a blunt object. Reporters scribbled, agents exchanged looks. In the gallery, someone exhaled loudly. Relief or disappointment, nobody could tell. The Queen of the Pacific, once whispered about like an untouchable force, had been reduced to federal math. Sandra didn't blink. No shaking hands, no tears, no collapse. She absorbed the ruling as if it was just another shipment count, another ledger entry. When the judge asked if she understood, she answered calmly, eyes forward, voice quiet. In that moment, her composure felt more frightening than rage, because it suggested she still believed in control, even here. As marshals led her away, chains clinking like a slow metronome, the room watched her back. Some thought they had witnessed the end of a legend, but those who had chased her case knew better. A sentence closes a file. It doesn't erase what a woman like Sandra leaves behind in the dark. When the sentence ended, the freedom didn't begin. It only changed uniforms. Sandra's release didn't happen under cameras the way her arrest had. It happened in a hallway, quiet, procedural, where federal custody handed her body to another machine. ICE officers waited with clipboards and cold smiles, ready to escort the Queen of the Pacific into a different corridor of punishment. Deportation. In the United States, she had become a solved case. In Mexico, she was still a living problem. The holding facility was smaller than a prison, but sharper in atmosphere. Men and women packed into temporary cages, faces drained by uncertainty. Here, nobody cared about legend. Nobody cared about power. They cared about paperwork, timelines, transfers. Sandra sat on a steel bench and watched the room like a woman reading weather signs before a storm. Because the storm was waiting across the border. Her lawyers spoke of procedures, of rights, of appeals, but Sandra understood the deeper truth. Deportation wasn't mercy. It was a handoff, a return to a country where enemies had memories, where factions had shifted, where old loyalty was never guaranteed. She had been absent too long. In cartel life, absence creates vacancies, and vacancies invite knives. Outside, in places she couldn't see, men argued over what her return would mean. Some wanted her silenced. Some wanted her used. Some wanted revenge for raids and betrayals triggered by the vault. And in the middle of it all stood the same question law enforcement feared to say aloud. If she returns, does the empire wake up again? The escort came at night. They chained her again, guided her onto a transport plane, and the air smelled the same as her extradition, cold metal, and inevitability. Only now, she wasn't being moved toward a trial. She was being moved toward uncertainty. No judge, no plea deal, no federal predictability. Just Mexico's shadows waiting like an open mouth. As the aircraft descended, city lights spread beneath her like scattered embers. Sandra stared through the small window without expression. The deportation file was stamped. The paperwork was complete. But she knew paperwork didn't protect you on the ground. When the doors opened, the humid air rushed in like a warning, and the Queen stepped back into the world that had made her, where justice didn't always wear a badge, and the next sentence could be written in blood. In the end, the courtroom didn't destroy Sandra with bullets or legends. It destroyed her with paper. The myth was easy. Queen of the Pacific, a woman who ruled men with a glance, who moved tons across oceans as if borders were jokes. The public wanted that story. Clean, cinematic, absolute. A villain with a crown. The evidence was uglier and more precise. Binders filled with wiretap transcripts where coded phrases turned into container movements, shipping manifests with altered seals, banking records showing deposits sliced into perfect pieces to avoid alarms, phone charts mapping burners that lived and died in hours, surveillance photos of meetings where faces stayed hidden and hands stayed clean. Every page didn't scream drama. It whispered structure. Prosecutors laid it out like anatomy. Not one monster, but a system. Not one queen, but an organizer who understood logistics better than most corporations. They didn't need to prove she carried bricks. They proved she moved the world around the bricks. Routes, payments, protection, silence. And Sandra, sitting behind glass, watched her own legend shrink under fluorescent light. She had survived violence. She had survived betrayal. She had survived prisons. But evidence was different. Evidence didn't fear her. It didn't negotiate. It didn't bleed. By the time the final exhibits were entered, the room had changed. The Queen of the Pacific was no longer a rumor or a nickname. She was a trail of documents that pointed in one direction, cold and final. In that moment, the myth died. And what remained was the truth prosecutors wanted the world to remember. Crime isn't glamorous when you see it clearly. It's just paperwork written in poison. Mexico didn't welcome her home. It reclaimed her. The moment Sandra returned, the rumors spread faster than her footsteps. Some said she would vanish into protection. Others said her enemies would finish what prisons couldn't. But the state had its own message to deliver. The Queen of the Pacific was not a woman who could simply walk back into the shadows. Agents were already waiting. No dramatic sirens, no television crews, just uniforms, badges, and hands that moved with rehearsed certainty. When she was intercepted, the air thickened with the same cold inevitability she'd felt in Miami. Papers were presented, orders read aloud. A new file opened, this one stamped by Mexican authority, carrying the promise of unfinished punishment. Sandra didn't argue. She didn't ask for mercy. She only watched the faces around her, measuring which ones carried fear and which ones carried hunger. She understood what this was, Mexico's final bite, a political necessity, a warning to anyone who believed extradition was an exit strategy. The legal consequences followed like wolves. Hearings, transfers, new detention, new accusations tied to domestic crimes, older roots, older money. The system wanted to prove it still had teeth. And in the public eye, the narrative tightened. She had served time in the United States, but she could not outrun the country that had birthed her empire. For years, Sandra had treated borders like flexible lines. She had moved power across them with ease. Now the border became a wall that pushed back, hard, unforgiving, permanent. As she was escorted down another corridor, chains clinking again, the lesson hit the world with brutal clarity. Escape is temporary. The file always reopens, and the shadows never forget. In the silence after the headlines, the case didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a bruise that would never fade. Files closed, court dates ended, Chains stopped clinking in American halls, but the damage remained where courts never visited, on roads where couriers bled into asphalt, in kitchens where mothers stared at empty chairs, in neighborhoods where children learned cartel slang before they learned algebra. The empire Sandra helped build wasn't made of glamour. It was made of absence. Families destroyed by addiction that arrived disguised as profit. Bodies uncounted because paperwork can't list every missing person, swallowed by ports, deserts, and shallow graves. Men recruited young and thrown away fast, treated like tools with expiration dates. Girls taught to carry messages, boys taught to carry guns. Childhood traded for survival because crime always needs new hands. Even law enforcement carried scars. Agents who slept with loaded pistols under pillows, prosecutors who checked their mirrors twice, witnesses relocated until their own names felt foreign. Justice demanded courage, but it also demanded sacrifice, and not all sacrifices were visible. Sandra became a symbol because symbols are easier than systems. It's easier to call her a queen than to admit how many people built the throne with their silence. The truth is colder. She didn't poison the world alone. She moved through a world already willing to be poisoned because everyone wanted something: money, power, protection, escape. And when the myth finally collapsed into evidence, what remained was not relief, but a question heavy enough to haunt anyone who truly understood the case. When power is built from poison, who becomes the victim first? The addicts who fall, the children recruited, the men who enforce, the families who mourn, or the one who learns to rule without feeling until there is nothing left inside to save?